I'm Peter Adamson, and you're listening to the History of Philosophy podcast, brought to you with the support of the LMU in Munich. Online at www.historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode will be an interview about philosophical Sufism with Mohammed Rustom, who is Associate Professor of Islamic Studies at Carleton University. Hi, Mohammed.
Hello, Peter.
Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So I guess the obvious first question here is, what do we mean when we talk about philosophical Sufism? Obviously, it must have some relationship to philosophy on the one hand and Sufism on the other hand, but I suppose maybe it's a more specific idea than Sufism in general. It's some specifically philosophical kind of Sufism. Is that the idea?
Yes, well, the term philosophical Sufism is somewhat problematic because it can take in Sufis or Muslim mystics who were well trained in philosophy, the formal discipline of philosophy, and as well as philosophical theology in the later period. And it can also relate to authors who had a penchant for philosophical modes of expression, but who were not really philosophers in any way at all. So with that in mind, we can kind of say that philosophical Sufism broadly refers to the theoretical or doctrinal attempt on the part of Sufis to articulate some of these more central topics in Islamic thought pertaining to things like cosmology, ontology, theology, so on and so forth, but within the framework of what we can call their spiritual vision. This means that at minimum, we encounter in philosophical Sufism a more concrete kind of articulation of any given abstract philosophical or theological problem or position. While it's true that philosophical Sufism and philosophy are conceived here from one perspective as two sides of the same coin, I would not wish to indulge in the simplistic characterization that we sometimes find that says that philosophical Sufism is simply philosophy clothed up in mythic form or symbolic garb or something like that. Philosophical Sufism presents itself by virtue of its emphasis on the lived and concrete understanding of revelation as, if you like, a kind of improved version of philosophy or philosophical theology, but one in which the philosophical vision and revelation are kind of complementary and are articulated in something like a highly symbolic form. Now, often philosophical Sufism refers to the school of Ibn Arabi in particular, so there's that added nuance there. And this is because an increasingly systematic and more philosophical understanding of Ibn Arabi's own teachings eventually come to take center stage in the writings of his followers, particularly Ghunwi, who was, of course, his stepson and his most important direct disciple. Thus, the term school of Ibn Arabi describes a particular approach largely colored by the thought of Ibn Arabi himself to the major philosophical and religious issues which confronted medieval Islamic thought. But it should also be noted that the term normally used in Arabic and Persian to characterize the perspective of Ibn Arabi on the one hand, but also kind of philosophical Sufism more generally, is Irfan Nazari, or in Persian Irfan Nazari, which is normally translated as something like theoretical Sufism or even speculative Sufism, I guess would work. This is a fairly helpful designation in terms of what's happening in philosophical Sufism, conceived in the widest possible sense, but with the caveat that by the term theoretical Sufism, we mean here the wedding of philosophical activity and lived practical aspect of Islamic spirituality. There are thus, if you like, no armchair philosophical Sufis in classical Islamic civilization, if you will.
So it sounds like, in a way, we could think about philosophical Sufism either as part of the history of philosophy in the Islamic world or as part of the history of Sufism in the Islamic world, and either one would be legitimate.
Yes, on one level, this is correct, especially as we move further into the East and down the historical unfolding of the Islamic intellectual tradition, where the lines start to get blurred in so many different places. Philosophers of Aristotelian kind of peripatetic bent now writing as illuminationists on the one hand, and then engaging people like Rumi and Ibn Arabi on the other hand. So that kind of ambiguity, I think, that you're drawing on, or the kind of universal applicability of this term, really, it's kind of symptomatic of the more eclectic nature of the Islamic intellectual tradition in the post-Avicennan phase of Islamic history.
So you've already mentioned in passing the most important figure in the history of philosophical Sufism, and maybe the second most important, so Ibn Arabi and his follower Kunawi. Do you think it would be fair to say that Ibn Arabi was the first philosophical Sufi, or the first to do philosophy within Sufism?
I would not say that. On the one hand, as the tradition develops later, it has, of course, it's greatly indebted to him. But we find that Ibn Arabi is really following an intellectual trend within Sufism that largely was made popular probably by Ghazali's time, especially by Ghazali, in which, of course, a greater attention is paid to issues in cosmology and ontology primarily, but now within the framework of Sufi discourse. So one of the key figures in the integration of philosophy and Sufism, someone who was actually like a younger Andalusian contemporary of Ibn Arabi, was Ibn Sabin, who was much better trained actually than Ibn Arabi in the formal discipline of philosophy. Probably the single figure who was the most pivotal in terms of the harmonization of philosophy and Sufism. And when we can really start speaking about a kind of philosophical Sufism as such, is that the great Persian Sufi martyr Ain al-Qudat Hamadani, who died in 1131 of the Common Era, and who was put to death by the Seljuk government at the age of 33, ostensibly on charges of heresy. Not only was Ain al-Qudat important because he was the student of Ahmad Ghazali, Ghazali's famous younger brother, who himself was a major figure in the Persian world, but he was also very well read in Avicenna and, of course, Ghazali himself. He thus brings together, over a century before Ibn Arabi, two really important strands in Islamic thought, kind of like a careful synthesis between philosophy, theology, and mysticism in a manner which is more explicit than Ghazali in terms of his reliance on philosophy, but which conscientiously seeks to address certain perceived limitations in Avicenna because of his non-committal stance on mysticism. So Ain al-Qudat kind of stands as a seriously overlooked figure in this later Islamic intellectual tradition, someone who, for the first time articulates a number of concepts that would become kind of stock expressions and ideas in both Persian and Arabic language Sufism. For example, you have the concept of Muhammadan reality, the Haqiqa Muhammadiyya, which after Ain al-Qudat, as far as I could see, and particularly actually in Ibn Arabi and his followers, it really takes center stage. But the idea, we find it in Ain al-Qudat explicitly. The Muhammadan reality is identified with the first intellect of Neoplatonic Islamic cosmology. There is, in fact, some kind of indication in Ain al-Qudat's main theoretical work in Arabic. He wrote pretty much all of his works in Persian, but he has one Arabic book called Zubdat al-Haqa'iq, or the Quintessence of Reality. And if we read between the lines there, it seems that even Ibn Arabi's most unique doctrine of the nature of the divine names may have, at least in part, been influenced by Ain al-Qudat, but that whole question remains to be answered in further investigation.
Okay, that's really interesting. So it sounds like Ibn Arabi is not coming out of a void in terms of the effort to integrate philosophy with Sufism. He's rather responding to something that was already an ongoing process.
Yes.
And I think it's also interesting, by the way, that Avicenna was already central at this very early stage of philosophical Sufism. And that's something we'll see carrying on through the later Sufi tradition.
Yes, indeed.
So to what extent would you say that Ibn Arabi is actually doing philosophy in a systematic way? I mean, I've covered him already, right? So there's clearly a lot of philosophical ideas in Ibn Arabi, but he writes these incredibly long, sprawling discussions of all sorts of things, right? And really, from what I've read, it seems like usually attempts to cobble together a philosophical system from Ibn Arabi, have to take texts from here and there, right, bring them together, and then do quite a lot of interpretation. So do you think is that unfair, or do you think that's basically right, that he's not a systematic thinker, but that he has philosophically interesting things to say unsystematically?
Yeah, I think that's actually an excellent characterization. What makes Ibn Arabi, of course, so interesting is that, as you've noticed, I'm sure, in reading him, one of the things that jumps out is that there isn't a direct kind of engagement with the discipline of philosophy. In fact, we don't even have a record of him having read Islamic philosophy. I mean, he mentions, he never mentions Avicenna, for example, explicitly. But as you've demonstrated in your previous podcast, Ibn Arabi says that he met Averroes, and his writings do evince on one level a deep familiarity with the hosts of philosophical terms and concepts. But, the likeliest place Ibn Arabi would have learned of these was through his formal training in Kalam, or philosophical theology. Of course, he was very well versed in Mu'tazilite and Ashrite thought. And given the fact that that's not such a surprise anyway, because Islamic theology was thoroughly Avicenized by Ibn Arabi's time, we're thus not surprised that his ontology and its broad outlines is even quite Avicennan. That was standard fare in Islamic theology by Ibn Arabi's time, of course. So Ibn Arabi is not technically speaking a systematic thinker, so you're correct definitely to say that. And I'd say that he's not systematic in that he does not try to fit things neatly into an ordered worldview. He continuously, he'll refine his position, he'll affirm concepts from one different and even antithetical angle on one point, and then he'll go on later to deny it from another point. In fact, this is one of the reasons why Ibn Arabi in early modern scholarship was characterized as a madman. And even today, you'll have people call him, I remember at least one book has been written which tries to demonstrate how Ibn Arabi was kind of like a proto-postmodernist. Of course, there is a certain degree of coherence in Ibn Arabi's worldview as well. I wouldn't say a certain degree, I'd actually say a great degree of coherence, but it's far from being systematic in any real sense of the term. I mean, sometimes in the middle of a sentence in one of his books, he'll insert a parenthetical comments. He'll say something like, the current topic under discussion would actually have come before the topic that preceded this discussion. But then he'll tell us that his ordering of the material is a result of divine unveiling or kashf, and thus is not the result of his own intellectual efforts at systematizing. So the kind of anti-systematic spirit, if we can call it that, in Ibn Arabi's writings, and indeed the vast ocean of symbolism, as you mentioned, visionary experiences, arcane kind of mysterious references, that was clearly imbibed by Qunawi, interestingly enough. And Qunawi was, of course, very much a philosopher in a way that Ibn Arabi was not. And so Ibn Arabi trains Qunawi, he's his stepson, and the same individual ends up becoming so different in so many ways from Ibn Arabi. I mean, Qunawi, we have, for example, a handwritten copy in his own handwriting of Suhrawardi's Hikmatul Ashraq, Philosophy of Illumination, and he initiates, of course, a very serious correspondence with Nasruddin Tusi after having read Tusi's already famous commentary upon Avicenna's Isharat. So Qunawi represents a unique turning point in the history of philosophical Sufism in a way that Ibn Arabi doesn't, because we have here for the first time a first-rate philosopher, a theologian, but somebody who's trained by none other than Ibn Arabi himself. And he's got kind of a foot in the peripatetic and Ashraqi traditions, and he's also, for better or worse, we can call him an Akbarian, or someone who belonged to the so-called school of Ibn Arabi. And one of his own writings are quite different from Ibn Arabi's often in terms of, their modes of expression, their form, and even to some extent their content. They're far more systematic, logical, they're ordered, they're less, if you like, Baroque in style. And there's an element of the visionary there, but we now encounter a visionary who kind of crafts Sufi discourse to sound more logically rigorous and more philosophically inclined in terms of the language too. It can certainly be said that Qunawi is the single individual most responsible for the more reified kind of abstract manner of expression that characterizes the school of Ibn Arabi. And he intended to emphasize, as did every major follower in the school after him, especially Qaysari, Dawood al-Qaysari, he wouldn't necessarily have given pride of place to certain elements of these certain aspects of Ibn Arabi's thought, whereas Qunawi does. And in many ways, this is interesting because Qunawi, he's commenting on in many ways what is important, or what he finds to be important in Ibn Arabi's own articulation of his vision of things. And Qunawi's necessarily leaving out a lot of key kind of mythological, cosmological discussions you find in Ibn Arabi, and things that Ibn Arabi would say over 30, 40 pages in the Futuhat. Qunawi, he'll have a one-page dense explanation of what's going on there, and in a language that I think his intention is to really speak to audiences whose ears, so to speak, were not as well trained as his were in understanding his stepfather.
Right, so sort of Ibn Arabi for dummies.
Yeah, in many ways, a kind of dumbed down version of Ibn Arabi. In fact, a teacher of mine once said to me, we should stop calling it the school of Ibn Arabi. We should just call it the school of Qunawi, because it's largely, like the all the followers after Qunawi or after Ibn Arabi, they're in one way or another influenced by Qunawi, and he's really seen as kind of like the filter to interpret Ibn Arabi. Even Jami, the famous poet, Persian poet who died in 1492, who was very much a follower of the school of Ibn Arabi, in one of his books he says that if you want to understand Ibn Arabi, you can only do it through reading Qunawi. So you kind of have this acknowledgement even into the 15th, 16th century that this person is really the prism through which Ibn Arabi is to be interpreted.
So let me ask you about a couple of the philosophical issues that seem really central, I think, both for Ibn Arabi and Qunawi. And of course, they're both going to have to do with God and God's relationship to the world, since it doesn't get more central than that. And maybe we can go straight to what might be the most obvious worry that someone could have about these philosophical Sufis, which is that they seem to be describing the created universe as nothing but a manifestation, and maybe an illusory manifestation of God. And so this might make you think that they're some kind of monists. In other words, they actually think only God exists. Or maybe they're pantheists. In other words, they think that everything is God. Do you think they can be defended against these charges?
Now that's a trick question. In a sense, see, the easiest way to reply to your question would be to say yes, and since there are plenty of passages in Ibn Arabi in particular that can be read as exclusively a kind of form of monism or pantheism or panentheism, or even as something that brings together, one or all of these isms, like pantheistic monism or something like that. Yet the problem here, as I see it, really has to do with whether these kinds of terms, reductive as they must necessarily be, can really do justice to Ibn Arabi's vision, which stresses in the same breath really oneness and unity, but there's alongside that multiplicity, otherness, and even relationality. So let's take, for example, the question of pantheism. Does Ibn Arabi say that there's an essential identity or some kind of identity with God in the cosmos? Yes, he certainly does speak like this, and that was enough, of course, to drive Ibn Taymiyyah mad. I mean, he liked Ibn Arabi to a point, but after a while, he just lost. I think he just stopped being patient with him, and then he decides to, refute him and call him an incarnationist and all kinds of things, or someone who he was an ittihadi, someone who didn't really distinguish between the creator and the creature. Ibn Arabi would tell us that does not in any way explain the entire picture. So while he'd say, yes, that is true, God and the cosmos are one or something like this, God as identified with the world or being in the world or part of the world, he'd say bespeaks God's givenness or his revealedness or manifestness in the cosmos, which points up to what he'd call his immanence or tashbih. And at the same time, Ibn Arabi places just as much, even more actually, emphasis on how the cosmos is not God in any sense of the term, how God is so utterly beyond and distinct from the world and stands above it by virtue of his inaccessibility or hiddenness or non-revealed face, if you like. And that points up his transcendence or his tanzih. So Ibn Arabi commonly refers to the cosmos as he, not he. Huwa la huwa, he, not he. And that does away with the kind of simplistic either-or kind of scenario in which the explanation of the cosmic situation and God's relationship to it tries to, trap God. And is it like this or is it like that? The huwa la huwa seeks to really retain both. I'd thus be very cautious to use any of these terms, pantheism, monism, so on and so forth. If we were to use them, we'd have to add a great degree of qualification. And by the time these qualifications can be made, Ibn Arabi's, if you want to say he's a monist, sure, but then all the other stuff, the very terms in question would then really not carry much weight, because we'd have to add so many caveats and so many explanations, and we'd have to really gloss these terms that they just lose much of their significance. So, I mean, from this perspective, even a term that is used often to explain the perspective of Ibn Arabi and his followers, wahdat al-wujud, or the oneness of being, even that phrase, I mean, it's something that Ibn Arabi doesn't use the term himself, and it only becomes, a technical term 3 or 4 decades after his death. But that term also, it has certain major limitations to it, because it can be perceived as emphasizing only the he aspect of the he not he formula, and that's certainly how Ibn Taymiyyah understood the term, and many other later detractors of Ibn Arabi as well. For example, Shaykh Ahmad Sirhindi, the famous Indian Sufi who died in 1624.
It seems like what you're saying is basically that Ibn Arabi gives us this interesting dialectical idea where the world is both God and not God.
Yeah.
And so it would be overly simplistic to just take one side of this polarity. But on the other hand, I mean, as philosophers, we're probably not too happy with someone saying, well, the solution is to just contradict yourself all the time. And so it seemed to me, and this is something I talked a bit about in the episode on him, but I wanted to get you to say something more about it. It seemed to me that one of the most promising moves he makes to explain this position without just saying, P and not P are both true, is to describe the world in terms of divine attributes, or the names of God.
Yes.
Because it seems like a name plausibly is both in a sense the same thing as the named thing, and in a sense not the same as the named thing. But on the other hand, it's hard to understand how something like a name could metaphysically be the same as the created universe. So do you think the point he's trying to make there, is that more of an analogy? So is he saying that created things relate to God the way that names might relate to the bearer of the name? Or is it actually that we are literally the names of God as created things?
This too is a trick question. Ibn Arabi, his most common way of speaking about what the names are, or really what they're not, is by speaking them as relationships. So this is something that he does, which seems, at least from one perspective, quite revolutionary in the history of Islamic thought. Because, I mean, the way we speak about the divine names in classical Islamic theology was to maintain that they somehow inhered in God, or God's essence, what they've called qa'ima bidhatihi, but not in a way that kind of gave them independent ontological status, such that they could be said to be superadded to it. So for many medieval Muslim theologians and presumably some philosophers, the objective kind of ontological status of the divine names was never really called into question. It was a given, even if their modality could not be easily understood or explained. Ibn Arabi comes in the scene and he vehemently rejects this common type of picture of the divine names. He says that the divine names do not inhere in God in any way, and he says that they're not ontological entities, which is like one of his main points, and he really tries to explain things from that perspective. He says they're not umur wujudiya, or ontological things. So instead, he says that they are, technically speaking, relationships, nisab, between what we can call God as revealed or manifest, and the objects of God's knowledge that do enter into concrete existence. So what Ibn Arabi and the later tradition called loci of self-disclosure or manifestation, madahir in Arabic. So the divine names come about as a result of God's self-disclosure or manifestation, and they thus make the God-world relationship for Ibn Arabi possible. Yet the cosmos, it's nothing other than a conglomeration of the divine names, we can say, as displayed through the existentiated aspects of God's knowledge. So the universe is impregnated ultimately with the divine attributes, and the very multiplicity in the cosmos. Therefore, as we see it, because it manifests, the attributes obviously point to the divine names. So by the same token, since the divine names are relationships for Ibn Arabi and not actual ontological entities, the multiplicity in the cosmos is in actuality not any real kind of plurality. So this kind of move that Ibn Arabi is making here, where he's emphasizing their reality on one level, and then ultimately, because their relationships, they're ultimately unreal, has posed the greatest, I think, philosophical challenge for his later interpreters. How do we understand these names? Because the names, they allow for multiplicity to emerge, and at the same time, they're paradoxically the very reason for the world's relative unreality.
So actually, I find that very helpful philosophically, because I mean, if the names really denote relationships or relations, it does seem like a relation is a real thing without being an entity in its own right, which is kind of what he wants, right?
Yes.
So let me ask you something rather different now, just about the later historical influence of Ibn Arabi. And actually, maybe we can start with a contemporary of Qunawi, namely Rumi, who's maybe the most famous Sufi, even more famous than Ibn Arabi, because of his poetry and the popularity of his literary outputs. These two were friends. Qunawi and Rumi were friends. They're even buried near each other in Konya. And it seems a little bit hard to wrap our minds around, right? So Qunawi is, as you were saying before, systematic, even sort of technical approach to Sufism. Rumi, this kind of ecstatic poet. So how do we reconcile two such different authors as being two outgrowths of the same Sufi tree, as it were?
Right. Well, that's again another very, very important question. There's a really nice anecdote, and there are all kinds of anecdotes about in which Qunawi figures, but this one in the later tradition, it tells us that one day Qunawi and Rumi are sitting together in Konya, and one of Rumi's students comes up to him and asks him a question that had been bothering him, and Rumi gives him, in characteristic fashion, a couplet in Persian, and the student's happy, and he walks away, and he's very pleased with his answer. So Qunawi turns to Rumi and he says to him, "How is it that you can make such difficult ideas seem so simple?" And to this, Rumi responds, he says, "How is it that you can make such simple ideas sound so difficult?" So what is important to keep in mind here is that neither Rumi nor Qunawi saw a problem with each other's different modes of expression. I mean, Rumi's thought evinces some of the theoretical, philosophical tendencies which characterize Qunawi. I mean, Rumi was a Maturidi theologian also. But Qunawi's thought also evinces some of the more poetic tendencies that we find in Rumi. And judging from the plain sense of Rumi's reply to Qunawi, he probably did think that Qunawi was unnecessarily complicating things, if you like. So having said that, there is a caveat here that we need to introduce, at least where Rumi is concerned. He's often seen as kind of being an anti-intellectual or anti-philosophical person. I mean, and there's plenty of verses in his poetry to corroborate that kind of a position. The most common verse, surely, is the one in which he says that the leg of the philosophers is wooden. A wooden leg is terribly unsturdy. Pay istidlaliyan chubin bovad, pay chubin sakht bi tamkin bovad. But one contemporary scholar, at least one that I've seen, emphasizes here that Rumi doesn't say the philosophers don't have a leg to stand on. He says that they do, but that it's just wooden, so it's not enough to allow them to, in Rumi's language, fly up to the heavenly empyrean. So in order to do this, Rumi would emphasize love, and that's, of course, the thing that he's known best for. But I get the feeling that Qunawi would not necessarily disagree. I think that ultimately they see their goal is essentially similar, even if their modes of expression and intellectual types really were not the same.
Maybe we could even say that, in a sense, they take on two different sides of Ibn Arabi's thought, because obviously Ibn Arabi is full of poetic imagery, and also, there's the earlier sort of tradition of love poetry in Sufism. So Rumi is taking that on, and Qunawi is taking on the more technical, philosophically influenced aspects of Ibn Arabi.
Yes.
And how appropriate that he was uniting these two apparently contradictory tendencies in himself.
Yes, exactly. Right.
Just one last question, looking ahead a bit to where we're going in future episodes. Obviously, Sufism has this massive influence across the Islamic world, really down to the present day. But can you say something a little bit more specifically about philosophical Sufism? So what sort was the kind of geographical spread of philosophical Sufism? I mean, obviously, we've been talking about people who wrote in Persian as well as Arabic. So certainly there's this philosophical Sufi tradition in Persia. What about, for example, in India or elsewhere in the Islamic world in the, let's say, the early modern period?
Right. So what's particularly interesting here is that, like you said, the philosophical Sufism or Sufism of a more kind of theoretical type really spreads throughout the eastern lands of Islam like wildfire. I mean, you have this is a phenomenon for at least over the next 500 years. You have people in the Ottoman period, for example, writing in sometimes Persian, but often Ottoman Turkish, like Ismail al-Qaravi, who's directly bringing together Ibn Arabi's thought. And actually, he was a commentator on Rumi too. And the Ottoman world was so vast that you have authors in that universe who belonged to, who lived in places like today will be Bosnia, Turkey, Syria. So very, very vast geographical expanse. Of course, Persia and Central Asia. In India, where the school of Ibn Arabi in particular had a very important second wind, if you like. The writings there tended to be in Persian because most Indian Sufis in the later period wrote in Persian, in Arabic and Persian, or even like an Arable Persian. And there, the aforementioned Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi, he was very important for in at least responding to Ibn Arabi, even though he wasn't necessarily always on board with his central theses. Shah Waliullah Dahlawi was a major figure also who was working in the Indian context and who had a very important role to play in bringing Ibn Arabi's thought and bringing philosophical Sufism into something like a more mainstream intellectual discourse, because he was a very well-respected scholar, one of the ulama class as well. So India's case is interesting. We have many other minor figures in India, Khwaja Khord and Mubarazallah Ilahabadi, people like this, all of whom their writings really evince a very deep kind of penetration, if you like, of the central tenets of the school of Ibn Arabi, and who, like Qunawi and like his later followers, all try their hand at systematizing this worldview. And then what happens in India is you have many, practical Sufi manuals written by Sufi masters, guides of how to get there, so to speak, but which conscientiously engage the school of Ibn Arabi. One of the most interesting later developments in which philosophical Sufism has yet another sphere of influence is actually in China, which is quite surprising. I mean, research into this is only being done today in a more sustained fashion. But by the 17th century, you have very important Chinese ulama, or Chinese scholars, Wang Dayu, Lu Ji, people like this, who, in order to attempt to explain Islam to their Chinese counterparts, most of whom were Neo-Confucians, they drew on the writings of Ibn Arabi and his followers, usually through Persian translation. But they did so by crafting the Chinese language now to speak the language of Neo-Confucianism. So you have Chinese Muslim authors drawing on Ibn Arabi's ideas, but recasting them in Chinese and in such a way that a Neo-Confucian could kind of understand it, and also some of their Buddhist colleagues as well. And that's a trend that in many ways characterized the later intellectual life of the Chinese Muslim Chinese. In many ways, it's also symptomatic of what's happening in North America and Europe in the 20th century and even into now the 21st century, where you have many authors who, for one reason or another, espouse the cause of Ibn Arabi or the school of Ibn Arabi or philosophical Sufism or the wedding of philosophical Sufism, and who seek to remold even the English language, for example, to speak these things, or French. So that's the influence of the school of Ibn Arabi on Sufism proper. But it also has a very important sustained influence on the discipline of Islamic philosophy as well. And this is most clearly seen, of course, in Mullah Sadra, the writings of Mullah Sadra. The entire school of Isfahan, right into the 20th century, even until today, you have many authors in Iran who are followers of Mullah Sadr or espouse his views, but who have a vested interest in Ibn Arabi. So in Mullah Sadr, you have the wedding of several different strands of Islamic thought, the Shiite theology, of course, very deep engagement with the philosophical tradition. Mullah Sadr's respondent, Suhrawardi, obviously, and he takes Ibn Arabi extremely seriously, to the point that he's even himself accused at some points in his career of being too pro-Ibn Arabi or too pro-Sunni. So all of these trends, if we look at them together in terms of the geographical dispersion of the tradition, we have a very, very wide expanse in which Ibn Arabi's ideas and the systematization and articulation of his ideas go into so many different modes, so to speak. You have them in practical manuals. Now they're in Chinese, speaking Confucian Chinese. They're in philosophical texts. Of course, the poetic tradition is greatly indebted to Ibn Arabi. And it actually, Ayn al-Quzat and Ibn Arabi actually meet up in the Persian poetic tradition as well, where you have Ayn al-Quzat speaking theoretically about many of these ideas in Persian, and then Ibn Arabi's school articulating some of the same ideas in Arabic and then in Persian. And then you have poets like Iraqi, who died in the 13th century, or Mahmud Shibistari, who died in the following century, trying to bring them together now within the medium of the poetic tradition. And so Persian poetry also is given a new life because of the school of Ibn Arabi.
Thanks. That's really remarkable and amazing. I mean, obviously, the later history of Sufism is so vast that it could be the subject for its own series of podcasts. Right. So someone should really do that, Mohammed.
Yes.
Just saying.
We're taking hints.
Right. Exactly. So thank you very much. You also mentioned a lot of things that I'll be getting on to look at. So philosophy in the Ottoman tradition, in the Mughal period of India, and in especially, I guess, the Safavids. But more proximately, next week I'll be moving on to something very different, which will actually be the ongoing tradition of logic in this period. So I hope the audience will join me for that. For now, I'll just thank you, Mohammed, for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
And please join me next time for the next installment of The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps.